All right, welcome to my 6-month update learning Latin. It's more like 6.5, but this is when I was able to get the update in. So let's jump right into it. Let's talk about what I read, how much I've done, my progress, and the plan moving forward. So number one, channel update. Let's take a look. The last month, again, apparently people are interested in my content, which is great. Over 2,000 views. So good job, everyone. Thanks for checking out my content, and I'm glad people get some value out of it. I mostly do this channel for myself, but it's fun also to see that other people like it as well. Okay, so let's talk about what I read in the last month and a bit. So currently I'm up to 370,000 words read. So we're talking the average novel is 50 to 7, let's say 50,000 words. So that's about the equivalent of 7 novels. That's how much I've read. Now the question is, what did I read last month? So I mentioned last month that I wanted to balance more easy extensive reading with some more hard material to get into to improve my ability, and so I did that. So number one, I finally finished Fabulae Syrae ages ago, it feels like. So let's see what I wrote about it. So there were a few stories that were difficult. Chapter 32 starts using more difficult word order, I say, for poetry. The reread was way easier than before, mostly because I already knew the stories, most of them, because most of these stories come up again and again, and I've also, because I kind of grinded through them before, it was fine. It was pretty easy. There was the occasional tricky spot though. Now, I had already read up to the chapter 32 stories, so those, I think that's like about 35 stories, something like that. And I had already grinded through them and looked up a bunch of words. So months later, and on my reread, those 7 chapters, 35 stories or whatever, I found pretty easy, honestly. But the 5 stories that followed that I didn't get through before, I actually didn't find very hard at all, both in terms of vocabulary and grammar. I just honestly read through them pretty quickly. And the only stories that were tough were the last 5 stories, because those are the ones with a lot of Ovid in them, I believe, a lot of poetry, like original text. Now the prose stuff that was by the author, Luigi, I believe, that stuff I didn't find too hard. But the Ovid stuff, mostly for reasons of vocabulary, I found pretty challenging. There's obviously word order and stuff of poetry is challenging. You have an adjective at one end of the line and the noun on the other side or something like that, and you have to beware of that kind of thing. But overall, Fabulae Syrae, after reading 300,000 words, I didn't find very difficult. So that's cool. So it was very redeeming, because when I first tried to go through it, when I was still going through Familia Romana, I found it extremely difficult. So it was a bit of a redemption that turns out if you do a lot of reading, a lot of easy reading, the hard stuff eventually becomes easy. So I didn't find Fabulae Syrae very difficult at all going through it, other than, again, the Ovid selections, which were challenging as a result of vocabulary. Now, I also did some other sort of extensive reading. I read through the first 2 books of the Oxford Latin course. Carla Hertz, found in Antiquity, she's talked about them as strictly worse than the Cambridge Latin course, which I think is very fair. I actually didn't mind reading them. I actually quite enjoyed them. It's hard for me to comment on, is it a good textbook for beginners, because, as I'm farther along, I get the sense that it's not that great as a textbook series. It's purely beginner. But if anything, the more I go along, the worse the textbook series is in terms of scaling vocab and grammar. In a way, it's almost better for me, because there's more vocabulary I can learn and more complicated stuff. The exact sequencing of the grammar stuff doesn't actually matter, because I've seen most of the most common grammar stuff. So in terms of just reading through it, I enjoyed it. 16,000 words. I enjoyed the stories, the history, and all that stuff, and it was a good time. Again, it's like I put like 50, 60 words or something, maybe a little more into Anki from those books. Overall, pretty easy to read, a lot of fun. It was great. I didn't do the 3rd book just because it's mostly just authentic excerpts from famous authors, like authentic text. So I didn't see the point in reading that. And then finally, I also read Ecce Romani, just the first book, mostly because the 2nd book is hard to find standalone on the internet. So I just read the first one, 6,000 words. Surprisingly enjoyable as a read. There's a lot of memes apparently on the internet about it mostly being about a cart being stuck in a ditch, which it is, but the stories were surprisingly entertaining, and I did enjoy it. The vocabulary was very easy, the grammar was very easy and stuff, but so it was just very great for extensive reading. I read through it very quickly, just very enjoyable. So that was cool. Now, in terms of other readers, I also read, there was one called Annus Primus, I believe, or Primus Annus, one of those two, Annus. I found it just extremely boring and I gave up about a third of the way through. It was just way too easy or simple or boring. I'm sure it got better as it went along, but I skipped it. And then there was this other book, Puer Romanus, which I found extremely difficult, just not necessarily in terms of grammar or anything, just so much vocab. I don't really know, I just find it a little perplexing. I'm assuming that a lot of the book is actually very lightly adapted excerpts from real stuff. That's my assumption. It's the only thing that would make sense. But I was very surprised. I found it just way too hard, way too dense in terms of vocab, and gave up. Because if I'm looking up like multiple words every single sentence, it's just no, that's not going to work. So I skipped that. I also read Latin Reader, A Nature Study. And this one talks a lot about natural phenomena like the sun and the moon and the earth and stuff like that. And surprisingly, and I thought it would be interesting because it's been recommended, I saw online. I thought it would be interesting. It's not just about the same old myths or the same old historical events, that kind of thing, but I ended up not liking it very much. I found it very boring. Sometimes it was way too simple, and then at the very end, way too hard. And then it just randomly started covering the Gallic Wars. So just kind of a strange book. It was just, so it was weird vocab sometimes, weird, too easy sometimes at the end, just basically Gallic Wars again. So it's like, what's the point of this book? Again, I don't mind necessarily the unadapted stuff because it's good to be continuously exposed to the real deal stuff, but I wouldn't recommend it necessarily as a particularly good read. Again, it's only 8,000 words, so it's not going to make or break your Latin, so I would just skip it. I also read Patria, which is a companion book, or I guess a sequel to Ora Maritima, which I think I talked about in a previous video. And when I read Ora Maritima a couple months ago or 3 months ago, something like that, I found it super hard. I don't remember if it was in terms of vocabulary or grammar, probably grammar. And I think it's meant to emulate Julius Caesar's style of writing, but I found it super hard when I read that. But when I read Pro Patria, I didn't actually find it super hard. I found it like a little bit boring, but it was a good level. It was like pushing me. It was pretty much right at my level. There was like some weird pro-imperialism themes to it. It talked a lot about the Boer Wars in South Africa and the British Empire. And, it's kind of clever because you can kind of see the parallels between the British Empire and the Roman Empire, but not in like, the specter of imperialism and colonialism has gone throughout history and how terrible it is. It was kind of the opposite. It's like, this is the duty of the British. Like, unless it's like there was an irony to it that I was not seeing, it was just a little bit icky in terms of themes. But in terms of actual just reading and quality of the experience, it was great. Because again, Pro Patria, when I read it, roughly 300 something thousand words, was right at my level. It felt good reading. I was being pushed forward in terms of the sentence structure and vocabulary, but it didn't feel overwhelming and it didn't feel too easy either. So here's one for, again, there's another fuller anecdote of extensive reading paying off. When I read Ora Maritima, it was too hard, but after a bunch of extensive reading, its sequel, not that hard. So great. I also read Scalae Primae by Spencer. Again, good level, mostly enjoyable, probably a little bit too simple in terms of grammar sentence structure, but quite a lot of unknown vocab. So in a way that's kind of perfect because vocab is one of the issues I have. So, I can figure out grammar if I know the vocab, but if I don't know the vocab, the grammar is not going to help me. So the very, very last few pages were super hard that I just got through. And last one, this one's a strange one because where it's at it was way too hard from where it's at. Like it's kind of divided into the beginning are just fables, like Aesop's fables style stuff. And then later I don't remember, they're probably like adaptations of Julius Caesar or Livy or Cicero or something. I don't actually remember too much. I think there were historical stories though. So I guess Livy, I want to say, I'm not really sure. Yeah, at a certain point it became like super difficult about halfway through. And again, as it says here, lightly adapted or authentic texts for the most part, about halfway through. And so I mostly just read it, but I didn't really look much up. I just went with the flow and tried to understand what I could. So it was a bit too hard for where I was at. So again, it's interesting going through these different readers and realizing that my order just certainly was not optimal. So yeah, so now so that's what I read basically for the last bit. So now I'm at 370,000 words. Now my plan is, so this was my original plan. So what I'm going to read up until basically only do an authentic text. I'm kind of done with like the reader train and be off into intermediate land. So the plan originally was first Latin reader by Nadine. I'm about a third of the way through that. I'll talk about that in a second. And then I kind of want to read Latin via Ovid just for like completion's sake, because I've read like almost all like the most of the popular beginner textbooks, so I thought it'd be fun to just do that one as well. But there's also a collection from different textbooks of stories that cover the history of Rome and the history and I guess myths of Greece. Epitome Historiae Sacrae, which is an LLPSI reader about simplified Bible stories, which I don't think would be very hard. At Alpes, of course, and then of course Sermones Romani. It's hard to say. And then finally, Roma Aeterna. And then after that, I'll go on to authentic texts. But I think I'm going to change this plan. So I'm not actually going to read Latin via Ovid. And I'm also not going to read these two. Like, it's not that there's anything wrong with reading them, but I think just where I'm at, I think I need to focus on, I need to change slightly my strategy and kind of lean more towards, push through into closer towards the authentic text and the more difficult material, and not so much on just pure extensive reading. Is that a good strategy? I don't know, but this is my current plan. So again, like I said, I'm reading First Latin Reader, which is, from what I understand, so it's about American history, but the sentence structure and expressions and collocations, I think it's called collocations, they're meant to model Julius Caesar in the Gallic Wars, which I'm actually enjoying. I don't know if it's going to get super hard later. I would say it's a good challenge. It's definitely hard, but I am getting through it. I've been doing a little reading going back, but I think I'm learning a lot from reading it, and I feel like I'm improving quite a lot by reading it. So it's an excellent reader. It's by the same author who did Alpes, so I highly recommend it. And then, of course, I have to read Richie's Fabulae Faculae, just because it's such a famous and popular and good reader. And this one, again, because I do want to read medieval Latin, and so being familiar with these Bible stories in a simplified way makes a lot of sense. Apparently there's a lot of vocabulary in there, but that's just going to make going to, when I read the Vulgate later and other texts that are modeled after it, perhaps that much easier. Of course, I want to read Ad Alpes, and then finally Roma Aeterna. And is that enough reading to get to that point? I think so. I mean, I can already read the early chapters of Roma Aeterna, and so it feels like this is enough. I'm ready, basically. You know, I'll never be perfectly ready to dive into the difficult material, but I think I've smoothed things out a bit enough that it's time to push forward in that way. But we'll see. If I'm like feeling really stuck and unmotivated with these slightly harder stuff, and not that some of these are necessarily too hard, then maybe I'll do a little more extensive reading with something else, like with some of the text that I just deleted from the list. So that's the plan. And then when I get to authentic text, basically the plan is to read quite a bit of medieval Latin first, and basically stuff after the fall of the Roman Empire. Between, the definition of medieval Latin is complicated, I guess, between 500 and 1500, I guess, and read a bunch of that. Of course, no, I don't think the Vulgate is technically medieval Latin. It's like late Latin technically, but I definitely want to read that. There's a couple texts by a video. If you look up how to learn Latin, there's a video that's very entertaining, and he recommends reading a primer of medieval Latin and medieval Latin by Harrington. And I've taken a look at them, and they look pretty readable. So they kind of give an overview of a lot of famous and important medieval authors of Latin. He also recommended Historia de Duobus Amantibus, which is a erotic novel, as he describes it. It's pretty short. It's more like a novella. And Gesta Romanorum. I don't remember what those are about. History, I believe, of the Romans. Again, it's considered like one of the easiest of late Latin or medieval Latin stuff. So, and then after that, I want to read the Vulgate, at least the New Testament. Maybe I'll read the Old Testament as well. I'm not really sure. And there was a video by, I think it's the person, Jessica, I think her name is. She does the video, her handle online is Nasusurai, which is pretty funny. And she did a video about the Byland Abbey ghost stories, and she did a video about one of them, and I found it really good. So maybe I'll read through those. That's just kind of my tentative plan. And of course, I want to read the Gallic Wars as well at one point. I don't know what the order will be, so this is very tentative, but I am trying to look at Latin, the broad spectrum. Like Latin was not literally the 100-year BC, the 100 years in the early empire, right? That I'm looking at it from a broader perspective, like, the 2,000 years essentially of history, and it's all Latin. Again, whether or not one is better than the other. You can make arguments, but it all is Latin. Medieval Latin is Latin. It was used for communicative purposes, for a utility, and so that's considered Latin. And the more I read that, it's generally considered easier, so I don't see any reason why not to read tons of that and get comfortable with that before moving on and doing more classical Latin that might be a little bit more challenging. So that's my plan. Again, this is all very tentative, but I think I'm going to, this is my plan, these 5 readers that I'm going to read before I move on to beyond these readers, these like learner material stuff. Okay, so because again, I can already read the Vulgate. Like I've looked at it, I've looked at some excerpts here and there, look up the occasional word and stuff. But from what I've read, when I've heard, there's a lot of repetition in terms of vocabulary, and it's meant for ordinary people. So I can already kind of read it and decently. So in a way, I'm not sure. Like in a way, I should just jump into that stuff. But I'm going to stay the course and do these ones just because they are the most famous and important readers for Latin. So I'm going to do those first, and then head into medieval Latin, and then eventually to classical Latin. So we'll see. Again, I might change course at one point. At one point I was like, I'm going to read 1,000,000 words of this easy Latin. As it turns out, that journey is a bit more complicated, but that's the plan. So in terms of, now I've also talked about my optimized list of Latin and, how would I do this if I started from the beginning? Because again, at the beginning, I didn't really know exactly what order to do these things and how would I change things. So I have a revised, optimized Latin reading plan that I would recommend. I think that it's good. It's not perfect, and you might find that if you follow this, you might make some tweaks. So if someone does follow this reading plan, I'd love to hear from you exactly how it goes. If you're like, oh, this one was too hard in this order, or maybe you could have done this other reader earlier or something like that. But I think this is a reasonable reading plan for anyone. And some of them are paid resources, some of them are not, but I think it's a good plan. So as I mentioned probably in the previous video, the first step is just the first 25 chapters of Roma, Familia Romana, mainly because number 1, we already have LLPSI supplements to support that. And number 2, that's when the Familia Romana starts to get a lot harder. Like there's sort of a step up in difficulty, those last 10 chapters. So it's a good spot to just focus on those 25 chapters and getting that done. So as I mentioned previous video, read the chapter, read the corresponding chapters in Colloquia Personarum and Fabulae Latinae, read those corresponding ones, and listen or watch a bunch of YouTube. So there's about 65,000 words of spoken Latin that's relatively easy. And so you can just click on the list and it's a playlist of that stuff. So beginner Latin A, how many hours? There's like 10 hours of that. So great. It's nothing wrong with just putting, if you're reading chapter of Familia Romana and then watching 20 minutes of this a day, it's probably a good idea. But yeah, so I just basically calculated by, I think 60 words a minute is what I calculated for this stuff. I think that's what Carla Hurt said. So that's what I would suggest. So I think this is enough material. You can always supplement it with other stuff if you wanted to, but I think focusing on the 25 chapters, read through a chapter once, read the supplementary material, watch a few YouTube videos, reread the chapter again, and then move on to the second one, and at the same time doing Anki, the vocabulary in Familia Romana. And I think that's a good way of going about it. Once you've done that, you want to do stage 2. Now I reorganized this a little bit, and I put Legentibus first, mostly because it's like the highest quality stuff, and the earliest stuff of it, the easiest Legentibus stuff. Again, it's both high quality, low amount of vocab, but it's also very enjoyable. So why not do that first? So read chapter 26, read through all the novice stories, read chapter 26 again, move on to 27. So stories in easy Latin after 27, Pugio Bruti after 28, Fabulae Latinae volume 1 and 2 after 29. And then I threw Cornelia in there too. And so initially we have about 10,000 words, something like that, every chapter in addition to it. Because again, each chapter of Familia Romana, it's only 1,000 words. So you're not going to absorb everything you need in that one chapter. So you might as well supplement it with a lot of other stuff, especially because Legentibus stuff, it's not really super sheltered grammar, although it is somewhat sheltered, simplified. So it's really good supplements. And so, yeah, and then after that, Cornelia, a new Latin primer, and Carolus et Maria is just good stuff. So again, at this point, I think at around chapter 29, chapter 30, you're getting about 20,000 words of supplemental stuff. And then 31, we have Fabulae Latinae, and then I did the Cambridge Latin course 1 and 2. And then for 31, and then after 32, Cambridge Latin course Sisyphus and Cloelia, Puella Romana. And then chapter 33, Fables of Orbilius, Julia, and Pons Tironum, and finally Fabulae Latinae and Intermediate Latin Comprehensible Input. And then if you want to do chapter 35, Familia Romana, I call it Family Romana, you're welcome to. It's just 1,200 words. I found it super boring, but check it out if you like. And then finally we have stage 3. So this is all the stuff. Now, it's possible some of these things are unnecessary, so Latin by the Natural Method, definitely read it. Ecce Romani, it's not very long. It's a lot of fun to read, so check that out. Oxford Latin course, again, I think it's a pretty good read, just fun, and it's a lot of stories you'll see probably in other selections, so it's good stuff. And then a bunch of stuff. I put Septimus down here and Fabulae Syrae. This is at about 300,000 words, I believe. So at this point, Fabulae Syrae should be very approachable. Like, you shouldn't have too much trouble with it, but it's just good. It's a good read. It's good practice, and you'll have read some of these myths in other readers before, so that's going to help you. You won't. I did look up summaries before I read a lot of the Fabulae Syrae the first time around because I didn't know them at all. I wasn't very familiar with them, so you've already probably have read some of these if you're at this point. And then at this point, I put Ora Maritima and Pro Patria, which are kind of sequels. So they're kind of a pair, so it makes sense to put them after that. Scalae Primae, New Latin Primer, Richie's Faculae, and then the stuff. So this is my proposed optimal plan for reading. And it's possible some of these could be swapped out for other books, but from what I've seen out there, I think this is a good amount of reading to prepare you for the harder, more authentic material. So it's still a little bit of theory crafting because I didn't go exactly through this order, but I think it's a good method, especially because I feel a little bit, when I went through Familia Romana, even though I learned a lot in the later chapters, I think I would have benefited much more from them if I had a lot more supplementary material to just overall boost my Latin ability. Because I reread some of those later chapters and they're like way more comprehensible now. And I'm like, oh, this is what they were teaching here. I'm like, and so, I would have squeezed out more learning, I think, from them if I had supplemented them more. And so, I think this is, how many words is this? This is 500,000 words. That's from nothing to Roma Aeterna. And again, so I think this is a reasonable way to go about learning Latin from extensive reading. And so again, we'll see, how good I am, like when I get to Roma Aeterna and at Alpes and all this stuff. But yeah, so that's that. Now, if you really want to optimize in terms of like not paying too much money, you might consider holding off on reading chapters 27, 28, and 29 of Familia Romana and just focus on the Legentibus stuff, because you can read all the Legentibus stuff in a month if you wanted to. So if you just wanted to save money and not have to pay every month for Legentibus, you could consider just, instead of moving to chapter 27, just keep on reading the Legentibus stuff, do that first, and then go back and read chapter 27. And then you can just sort of add your supplements as you want, as you can go along. So, or just focus on Familia Romana and do it that way. So yeah, it's kind of up to you. Obviously, this is customizable and stuff, but yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable. I think it's enough reading to get at least to the medieval Latin stuff, that's the kind of the bridge probably to the classical Latin. So you don't want to stay forever and learn a material. Okay. So that's that. Now, the only other thing, I guess, is kind of like, what is my level currently? So I thought it'd be fun. I pulled up random samples from Fabulae Faciles and Ad Alpes and Roma Aeterna. Now, and we'll see kind of how good I am at this point. It'll be, I think, a useful, rather than like go through Anki or something, which is not as relevant. So I pulled this up mostly by random. So I'm going to read it aloud, at least a little bit, and then I will talk. I won't look up anything. I won't cheat. Just to kind of gauge like where I'm at. Okay, so if you're way better at me after 6 months, then good for you, I guess. All right, here we go. So this is, I guess, about Ulysses. Urbem Troian a Graecis decemanos obsessum esse satis constat. De hoc enim bello Homerus maximus poet irum Graecorum Iliadem opus notissimum scripsi Troia tandem per insidias capta Graeci longo bello vestidomu redire matura verum. Omnibus rebus igitur ad profectionem paratis navis deduxerum, et tempestatem idoneam nacti magno cum gaudio solverum. There we go. Good enough. So I'm just going to read it real quick, and then I'll talk about what I think it means and if there's any tricky spots. Okay, so the first sentence, so the city of Troy by the Greeks was basically besieged for 10 years. Now, I don't understand constat. I'd have to look that up. It looks very familiar. So yeah, satis constat, it's like enough something. Is it like, I don't know, like I thought it was like to notice, I guess. I'm not sure. So that's one tricky word where I think I'd have to look it up to understand the full sentence. And then the next sentence, of course, and then of this war, Homer, the most important poet of Greece. Oh, there was a little bit of blotch on the screen. And then they wrote the Iliad, etc. Troy was captured by a trap or like a scheme. The Greeks were of the long war tired and they returned early to their home. Everything was prepared ad perfectione. That would be like to depart, right? To leave. Omnibus rebus, everything, therefore, to leave was prepared to go away. And then a tempestatem idonea nacti magno cum gaudio solverum. So I think this means like, an ideal storm. I don't know what nacti means. I imagine it has something to do with like sailing. Magno cum gaudio is a common phrase I've seen before, just with like happily or the solverunt. I believe that I thought that meant like to solverunt, like that reminds me of the word to, I think, tie up or untie, one of the two. I believe it's untie. So that seemed a little confusing, doesn't seem to make sense to me in the context. So so I'd have to look up, definitely in this one, I'd have to look up 2 or 3 words to make sense of it. So I generally know what it's talking about, but it's because of my lack of vocabulary or just general lack of ability, it's still a little opaque, some of the specifics of it. But I generally understand, I think, the basic idea. But so yeah, there's that. And then let's look at ad Alpes. Posterio die ante oram quarta anxur facile perventum est, quo in oppido viatores polisper constiterunt, ut cibum caperent, nem liberi itiam tum essuriebat. Cum omnia iterum parata essent ad iter faciendum, sextus nusquam reperiri poterat, donec eum aspexit stassimus in area, ubi cupide audiebat servos tuos, qui inter se loquebantur. So this is much easier. I don't know why, like, I would have assumed ad Alpes would have been much harder than Fabulae Faculae, but the next day, before the 4th hour of the day, I guess, they easily arrived at Anxur, I guess. And then in this town, visitors polisper constiterunt. I assume that's like polisper is like slowly or gradually. Constiterunt, I think that's like come together or to congregate. Ut cibum caperent, nam liberi etiam tum essuriebat. So ut cibum caperent, to grab food, I guess. And then because this book is about like the travelers of the family. So it's not just any travelers, it's the specific family. So yeah, so maybe I'm slightly misinterpreting this. The children are hungry. And then the next one, cum omnia iterum parata essent. So when everything was ready to make the trip, nusquam, I'm not entirely sure what that means actually. Yeah, I'm not sure. Reperiri potera to, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a little confusing. Donec eum aspexit Stassimus in aria. So finally, Stassimus saw him in the sand, where this person desired to listen to servants who were talking amongst each other. So I would say that was a little bit easier than the previous excerpt. Again, I'm not saying ad Alpes is overall easier, but that part, again, other than that one part where I probably have a fuzzy understanding, maybe even wrong, it doesn't strike me as a particularly challenging passage. And now for some pain, I skipped ahead to about 100 pages into Roma Aeterna. I deliberately skipped all the Virgil Aeneid stuff because so many of those stories I've read many times, so it'd be kind of cheating. Some of those excerpts I feel like I've literally read. I skipped ahead to Livy part, chapter 42. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe it's probably not going to go great. And I'm not going to look at any of this stuff as I go through, but we'll just see how it goes. Rebus divinis rite factis vocataque ad concilium multitudine, quae nulla re nisi legibus in unum populum colescere poterat. Romulus jura dedit, ut homines agrestes novum regum vererentur, ipse se Augustiorem fecit insignibus imperi, cum vestem purpuream induit, tum lictores duodecim sumsit, qui fasces et secures gerentes regi antirent. So this is obviously pretty tough for me. I don't know, maybe it's not obvious, but let's go through it, see what I can make sense of it. Again, maybe I'll try my best to not look at the marginal notes, and then maybe I'll check the marginal notes. So rebus divinis rite factis. So I think that's like they're talking about rituals, like divine rituals, or like rituals to the gods, I believe. I don't actually know what like the context of this thing is, so I'm making it kind of overly difficult for myself. So I don't really have the. I'm assuming this is about the founding of Rome, but I don't really have the context. So they did that. They did those rituals, and then they called a big meeting, concilium, of lots of people. So of nulla ne re nisi legibus in unum populum colescere poterat. Legibus, like I want to say that's like a messenger, but it seems more like laws. I'm not really sure, and so it kind of I want to say that it's about. I don't know. It's like either about like, yeah, I guess I think it's a messenger. So something about only, accept only like messengers. Yeah, something about messengers, only they, colescere poterat, come together, to be able to come together in the populace. Romulus jura dedit. So I don't know, like jura, I don't know. I assume that meant like to swear or an oath. But according to here, I think it's laws. So yeah, so it's talking about laws. I think I think I'd have to look up some of these words. It's a little confusing. And then the last bit, ut homines agrestes novum regum verentur. The verentur, I think that means like to fear or to respect. Agrestis. Oh, I assumed it. So it says rusticus. So I would assume that meant the rural farmer people. So they feared so that the people would fear the new king. He himself, Augustiorem fecit insignibus imperi. So that Augustiorum, like, I'm not really sure what that's referring to. Like, it reminds me of the word for, I don't remember what it is, for like a narrow pass, but I'm not entirely sure what that means in that context. And, insignibus imperi, which is like the imperial symbol. Maybe like this is about like being an emperor or something like that. And then I don't know, or imperial, I don't know. Finally, convestum purpureaum induit. So he put on purple clothes, I guess. And then lictores, I'm not really sure. It says here custos corporis. Oh, it's like his like bodyguards, I guess. Qui fasces et secures gerentes regi anti iren. So fasces and secures, I'm not really sure what they mean, and it doesn't really say anything here. So I'm assuming though it's involved he's like security or protection or something. So I don't know how close any of that was. Like I can kind of see it. I'd have to look some stuff up to make sense of the passage. So and I'm making it doubly hard for myself because I don't have the previous chapters to help me here. So yeah, again, it's not obvious to me that it's an issue of grammar or anything. I think a lot of it is just vocabulary. If I knew some of these words, I think it would have been easier. So yeah, anyways, I wanted to do that. Obviously it's a little embarrassing to not understand things, but I thought it would be a fun way of sort of representing like kind of a marker, like this is roughly how much I can comprehend, so I can look back in 6 months and think like, oh wow, I barely knew anything in 6 months ago. So here's that. Okay, so I don't really have anything else to say. So again, the plan is just finish a first Latin reader by netting, and then I'll read Richie's Fabulae Faculae, and then Epitome Historiae Sacrae at Alpes and Roma Aeterna, and we'll see how that goes, because it was a little deflating reading that one passage on camera without looking anything up. Obviously it was a little rough, but yeah, there we go. Again, it doesn't, if I could look things up, I think my comprehension would have been way better, and if I had read the previous chapters as well. So anywho, so if you have any questions, feel free to read through the so-called optimized list, my theory craft list. I think it's a good list, and we'll see. Hopefully in a month I will update how I'm doing. Ideally I'd be into, definitely finish this one, maybe all the way up to Ad Alpes. We'll see, and then we'll go from there. All right, thanks.